I just repeated what I said on Monday, so not a lot of that is different. Anybody from Karen Crow? So Coach Corville obviously retired, so that's why I'm wearing the Karen Crow hat today. And the hat will also help to differentiate when I move my neck. It's kind of representing my nose, okay? So the first thing we're gonna do is, remember, I teach through repetition, especially the important things. I'm training you as my students, as young professionals that are going to go out into graduate school and profess human movement, that we do not use global landmarks and references for human movement. Sometimes it might work, but it doesn't work all the time, and that's why we don't use them. We can use local landmarks. We can use local references to our body to differentiate human movement. And today I'm going to emphasize two of them. I've already mentioned these, but today I'm going to emphasize these as our pubic symphysis, right in the middle of our right and left hemipelvis. So right in the middle, the interior of our pelvis. Our sternum, I'm trying to line these things up, the sternum and our nose. I don't like to use the eyes because the eyes can move without our head moving, okay? So pubis, sternum, and nose. If you had any differentiation from these three landmarks, one or more of those landmarks, then there was motion that happened at either the cervical, the trunk, and or the pelvis. Okay? So I'll give you some examples. Yoink. I could have left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, but yet nose still lined up with sternum, still lined up with pubis. So I don't have to have trunk motion when I rotate pelvis. Does that make sense? Okay. If I transverse pelvic girdle rotate, and you know that my sternum wants to go along for the ride, I don't have to do that. I could rotate my trunk to keep my functional circle of work, grip, sight, forward. So in this case, I could have left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, but now my sternum is not lined up. Don't pay attention to the nose because I can't bend the pipe. But now my sternum is not lined up with my pubis, right? So something had to move. Does that make sense? So it was almost kind of like pelvic girdle rotation. Did it rotate? Yes. If so, how? My sternum is no longer lined up with my pubis in the transverse plane, so something of my trunk had to rotate in the transverse plane. And then you just have to figure out how. My sternum is now looking at my right hip, so I had to have right transverse trunk rotation. It's subtle, but it had to happen because now these two things are no longer lined up. Does that make sense? Okay. Today, what I'm going to show you is I could keep my eyes if I have my functional circle of sight. And remember, all that is a fancy term of is what's your purpose? What's your function? If I'm trying to keep my eyes fixed, but let's say maybe I do want to reposition my hands and arms to work to my left, I could rotate my pelvis, my sternum, and my pubis stay lined up, but now my nose is not lined up with those two. Does that make sense? So it would look, I can't do all three because this is a rigid link. So what I'm going to try to do is something like this. See how these two are still lined up? But now this one is not. So in this case, I had left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. I had no trunk motion, but now my cervical is rotated to the right. sense? So these landmarks we can use to help figure out my position, my new position, and what type of motion had to happen once I know my change in position. Okay? Then it can get the hardest questions that I'm going to have on Unit 3 is stuff that involves the rotation of the trunk where the sternum is moving about the two fixed points on top and below it. So in other words, my nose facing forward, my sternum, well, I guess I could stay lined up to start off with. But if I do something like this, there's deviation here and there's deviation there. So all that tells me is that I have left transverse trunk and right transverse circle. That's it. No pelvic girdle rotation, right? Because the pelvis did spin. The cervical follows the exact same rules as the trunk. So that's why it shouldn't be like a whole new lecture for it. If the trunk can flex and extend in the fetal outfield, so can the cervical. It's really just, let's see if I brought my slinky. You've seen the slinky before. So it's really just a certain, if the whole spine is one big slinky, the cervical is this piece that goes from your cranium to your first rib. But it follows the same rules. Left lateral, right lateral, flexion, extension, right transverse, left transverse. Same rules, just in a different place. Cervical becomes thoracic when we get ribs. Thoracic becomes lumbar when we finish the ribs. We have no more ribs. Okay? So right and left lateral trunk, right, left lateral cervical. Landmarks that we talked about for trunk, shoulders and ASISs, right? Those little bony parts of your spine. Right shoulder gets close to the right pelvis, or right pelvis gets close to the right shoulder, the trunk bit to the right. In the cervical's case, we're going ear to shoulder. It's literally the same rules. Something on your skull, something on your rib cage, something on your pelvis. So if I go right shoulder, right hip, or right hip, right shoulder, it's right lateral. So if I go right ear, right shoulder, or right shoulder, right ear, it's right lateral. Does that make sense? From here to there is the same bending as from there to there. Simple. Okay. Chin to chest. Chin line is going to line up with your nose, unless, like, sometimes when you're fighting MMA, maybe it doesn't. But chin to chest just sounds easier to say than nose to chest. So chin to chest would be flexion of my cervical. Sternum to pubis would be flexion of my trunk. Here to there, chin to chest is just as much flexion as chest to chin. Chin to chest or chest to chin, doesn't matter. You still have the same bend. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the transverse. Nose or chin to sternum, lined up, anatomical. When they deviate, when I rotate so that my nose or my chin is facing more to my right side, right transverse cervical. Or when my right side moves closer to my chin or my nose, right transverse cervical. We've had this before. You know what's cool? We've had cervical before put in an analogy of the hip. You remember that? We've actually had this before. Here to there, right transverse cervical. And also here to there, right transverse cervical. Does that make sense? Here to there, right transverse cervical, here to there, right transverse cervical. It gets you to the same place. So it must be the same motion. Here's another way, if that doesn't quite sink in, think about it. If I flex my hip, I feel a stretch in my hamstring. So why wouldn't, if I flex my hip, I still feel the same stretch in the same? I still feel in the same place. It has to be the same motion. Human movement doesn't care what the room sees. Human movement doesn't care about global references. Human movement only cares about local references. Make sense? Okay? So, the reason I think this is important to kind of go over is because, again, on your Unit 2 test, you will have pelvic girdle rotations with trunk canceling out type of movements. So I think introducing you to the cervical will help to eliminate distraction and know exactly what type of trunk motion may or may not contribute. Not only that, you'll also be introduced to the cervical when we start on Unit 3, and it won't be as much information for when we get, guys, the upper extremity is confusing as heck. There's a lot of crazy stuff, illusion-wise, in the upper, because we gain mobility up here, and we trade that off with stability down here. So there's a lot of freaky stuff that's coming in Unit 3. I'm giving you a heads up. So it's actually better that I kind of introduce you to this now, so that Unit 3 is not as overwhelming. Okay. Any questions about using landmarks? We can use landmarks as long as they're in the body to see movement. So if I take my pelvis, or let's say I'm standing in, yeah, anybody have any relatives that exaggerate like their childhood? Like, oh, y'all are so lucky, you know, back in my day, we traveled, you know, 3 miles, we walked to school in the snow. It's like that, you can bring it up the mountains, that you can Africa. So what I'm saying is that back in my day, we didn't have like the ability to like pay student fee or get ID, like we had to stand in line. Like we couldn't do things virtually, so you had to like stand in all these different lines on campus. And so the analogy I want to give is that if you're standing in line, it makes sense that you may start off, you know, kind of strong, like I got this. But then after a while, like, your feet start to hurt, so then you shift the weight on one foot. And then since the majority of that weight is here and this leg is just kind of serving as a kickstand, then you're like, all right, this one's getting tired, so I'm going to shift the weight on this foot. Now this one's kind of as a kickstand. You see what I'm saying? You're going to kind of shift weight. So what I'm trying to get my students to really see is the subtleness of our hips rotating our pelvis and how our trunk bends or moves to cancel out the fact that the pelvis is trying to tilt us over. Make sense? It's subtle, guys. It's very subtle. It doesn't, you know, a lot of motions that we've had up until this point looks like they're moving. Some of the reasons some of these motions don't look like they're moving is because you have simultaneous movement. And with simultaneity, you're going to have canceling out of angular. So let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say. That if you're watching a boxing match or an MMA and someone throws a jab, their hand is translating forward. Great, but the hand is not a joint. Those joints rotate. What's happening is the elbow is trying to take the hand forward but to my left. My shoulder is trying to take my hand forward but to my right. And when those things happen at the same time, they can cancel out each other's rotation and summate each other's translation. But when you're just focusing on the hand, you may not realize that these things are happening at the same time. So in other words, when I do them in sequence, one at a time, it's going to look ridiculous and silly, but like, right? So what I'm saying is that when I do these things one at a time, like if I'm shifting weight from my left to my right, when I do them one at a time, it's obvious and it looks silly. But when you do them both at the same time, sometimes it's hard to see. Because as one is trying to bend my trunk one way, my trunk is literally bending the other way. And so it's hard to see what's happening here when those things are happening at the same time. Does that make sense? So that's why I like to use, at least to explain it, like I'll use like a book or a reference for like, if I'm shifting weight if my weight is on my left, I know that I'm pouring water out the right, or I'm rotating to the right, my pelvis. So I can kind of see that I'm not an anatomical, because my trunk would be here. Does that make sense? My trunk would be here if I was an anatomical. So it makes sense that I'd be bent to my left, closer. Helps keep your center of mass or your base of support. Helps keep your shoulders level. Helps keep your eyelids level. Okay, make sense? Transverse. Well, we did sagittal before, but sagittal, it may not look like a lot's happening, but a lot is happening. Anterior pelvic, because of hip flexion, and I'm going to have trunk extension unless I want to go for the ride. Does that make sense? Posterior hip extension, trunk flexion. Anterior hip flexion, trunk extension. Cool. Left transverse, left hip internal, right hip external, right transverse trunk rotation, if I want to keep my sternum straight. If my trunk didn't rotate, you would see this. Can you see why some people who aren't trained in seeing these things might say, well, your trunk did twist to the left. I mean, you're looking to the left now with your trunk. Just because I'm standing on a bus and the bus is traveling east doesn't mean I'm walking. It's kind of the same thing. So even though my pelvis is rotating to the left in the transverse plane because of hip motion, it doesn't mean my trunk has to do it. If my trunk were to rotate to the left, these 2 points would be differentiated. And sometimes that can happen. But think about it, you're summating motion in the same plane. That's when you're trying to look or work behind you. Summating of motion. Pelvis, twist to the right. Great, you got me as far as you can. Trunk, twist to the right. Great, I got a little further. And if I'm trying to see even further, cervical, twist to your right. I can see behind me. Make sense? But when you're trying to cancel out movement, whether you're working or trying to see, if the pelvis is trying to take everything above it to the left, and you don't want to go that way, you have to rotate that to the right. Make sense? Okay. That is it for your material for Unit 2. So what I'd like to do now is go into more detail about the use of stick figures to kind of help you guys study. I don't know what that is, but it's it. So some students use stick figures to help study the large part of stick figures. And so I thought I'd explain that to you. Maybe it's has anybody done the stick figures yet, or used it? Perfect. You don't have to, but maybe this is your thing. So what's great about stick figures is you don't have to be a profound artist, because it just uses representations of rigid links in our body. So in other words, lower leg, foot, and that's the ankle. I know it's not realistic, that's okay. From there to there would be plantar flexion. From here to there would be dorsiflexion. And then like you could even have a one part that's like kind of open chain, right? It looks like it's moving and it is. That's all open chain means for our class, for this class. It looks like it's moving and it is. The distal segment is free. It's open to move about the proximal, the way mechanics intended it when they intended the door about there. Then you can do kind of an illusion slide, right? So like closed chain, the foot stays fixed. So you can have something like that from anatomical. You can even do like little bullet points. Good Lord, man, I need to stop drinking so early. You can even do like a bullet point. In other words, like I started where the dots are and I did this. Or you could do the full from there to there. Dorsiflexion. And you can do there to there, plantar. And then you can choose to go from there up on your toes. You can do from there. Right. And then you can do like plantar from. Then you can like come back down. You can do like dorside to, dorside from. There's all these different ways you can do these kind of stick figure flashcards. For the people that are watching on the stream, my apologies. It's all new to me. They took away my chalkboard, man. Really did happen. Did y'all hear about that? So we had a visiting instructor from another country, and he was trying to get the board down, and he didn't know about the switching of that, and so he jumped up and just yanked it down and broke it. And because this building was made in 1986, they were like, so I lost my job. I'm gonna get over the COVID. All right. So think about it. That you can have flashcards for ankle. You could have, or another strat too. Sorry, my kids use that word a lot. Strat. Play video games. It's like a pickup one. You can do a flashcard, and let's say it gives you plantar flexion, or you can have specific flashcards that randomly right ankle, left ankle, bilateral. It's as detailed as you want. And then maybe like you could replicate it. So like, okay, right ankle plantar would look like, so maybe you could replicate it as the card comes, especially when you get to the pelvic girdle and stuff. I showed you one class, I forgot what day it is. Remember when we did the box and the pelvic girdle stuff? So that's kind of, I introduced you to stick figures with that, where like you can have a little box that it represents how the pelvis would be moving and how the trunk would be moving and the hips would be moving. So we've already kind of done like more advanced kind of stick figures, but this might be useful, from here to there, like right knee flexion, or you can do like a closed chain, yoink, 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 right? Dorsiflexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, and coming back up, plantar flexion, knee extension, hip extension. Something simple. I'll show you guys my beautiful workbook. I'll play it. Okay. So that might be able to help. That might be able to help you do some studying with some flashcards. Cool. Any questions about anything? clear on what you're going to be accountable for. Keep practicing verbiage. Flexions to, flexions from, extensions to, extensions from. Please keep practicing that verbiage. I think Miriam messaged me last night that they're trying to work on, like we did last time, a practical review on Friday. Cool. And then based on how that review goes, Monday I might go into more cervical stuff, or if you guys have questions, I just don't want to waste class. So much time. And I would never go into new material that's like a total 180 or something ridiculously new for a test that's coming up. So like if we did go over like cervical, it's looking like it's moving it is, you guys should be like, I already got it. Flexion, extension, right lateral, left transverse, right there. Okay, so just an example of the verbiage. Right transverse, and I'm just using froms and tos, so I'm just using this as an example. Right transverse from, left transverse to, left transverse from, right transverse to, right transverse from. It helps us declare a full range of motion in reference to anatomical position. Any questions? Good? Y'all are good? You sure? Who's going to try the stick figure stuff? You can try it. I think it can really help. And what I would like, though, is just asking if you can get a head start on the stick figures, so that way on class Friday, that would be some great things to ask Miriam and ask Sarah and whoever else comes. You know, hey, take a look at these, let me know what you think, and make sure these are cool. Okay? All right, you guys. Have a good day.